In March 2026, at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, at 2:11 a.m., inside the night vision monitoring room of the 30th Security Forces Squadron, a technical sergeant named Coles sat staring at a wall of 17 screens. He told me that at first, there was nothing unusual that night. No wind, no clouds, not even the usual fog rolling in from the Pacific. It had stopped 3 miles short of the coastline. The entire base felt like a steel island abandoned in the dark. Then his radio crackled with a sitrep from the rear patrol, eastern fence line, anomalous contact. He assumed it was coyotes. Out near Point Arguello, coyotes know every patrol route better than the soldiers do. He picked up his night vision goggles, pushed open the door, and stepped into a moonless California night. That was the last time he believed he was standing on the side of reality. I specialize in telling stories about supernatural events that emerge from the fog of war. Today's story begins with a simple fact. In March 2026, U.S. Northern Command made the rare decision to inform the public that, over the previous 6 months, multiple strategic military bases across the continental United States had been repeatedly penetrated by unidentified drone swarms. These incursions were not isolated incidents, nor accidental drift, nor the pranks of hobbyists. The Pentagon's language was careful but heavy. They used terms like systematic, unattributed, and beyond current response capabilities. Air defense systems were overwhelmed, electronic countermeasures proved largely ineffective, and even when F-16 fighters scrambled to intercept, the maneuverability and formation logic displayed by these objects made every known human aircraft look clumsy and primitive. But before I tell you Sergeant Cole's story, there's something you need to understand. When we talk about the fog of war, we usually mean the uncertainty caused by incomplete information on the battlefield. What I'm about to take you into is a different kind of fog, a suffocating gray zone at the boundary between reality and the unreal. In this fog, highly trained soldiers, billion-dollar infrared early warning satellites, and air defense systems designed to intercept supersonic missiles all become blind. Not because they've failed, but because what they're facing does not obey the physical rules we understand. It's a deeper kind of fog, not that we can't see the enemy, but that we can't even be sure the concept of an enemy still applies. When Sergeant Cole pushed open that door, he had no idea he was about to step into the deepest part of it. It took me a long time to piece together the full account from him. On the phone, he spoke slowly, often pausing, as if auditing every word for accuracy. He wouldn't give his full name, wouldn't disclose where he lives now, and wouldn't say whether he's still in service. He only said one thing. Sometimes you don't tell people because you're afraid they won't believe you. You don't tell them because if they do believe you, you'll never get to pretend it didn't happen. Let me start with the most boring part of that night. Vandenberg Space Force Base. The 30th Security Forces Squadron is responsible for protecting one of the most critical launch facilities on the U.S. West Coast. This is where the Minuteman III ICBM test launch systems are stationed, and it's also the primary hub for launching polar orbit reconnaissance satellites. In other words, it's a link in the nuclear deterrence chain where nothing can go wrong. Cole's night vision monitoring team spent their shifts staring at those 17 screens, looking for any infrared signature that didn't belong near the perimeter fence. Most of the time, their targets were coyotes, lost deer, or the occasional drunk from nearby Lompoc trying to cut across the base after a night out. The job was mind-numbingly dull. Cole told me he once tracked a signal for 3 straight hours, only to discover it was an opossum that had crawled into a substation box. That's why, when the patrol radioed in, "Eastern fence, anomalous contact," he didn't think much of it. But later inspection of that section of fence revealed a kind of deformation Cole had never seen before. It hadn't been cut or forced open. The metal itself looked as if it had been melted by an intense heat source, and then instantly cooled, forming an irregular, wave-like distortion. Yet in the sand beneath it, there were no footprints, none human, none animal, not even tire tracks. It was as if the force that melted it had appeared out of thin air. The 2 soldiers on patrol reported a smell. Not the burnt odor of electrical shorting, not the sharp sting of chemical agents. Cole described it as a wrong smell, something like ozone, rotting seaweed, and oxidized metal under extreme heat, but not quite any of those. The youngest soldier, a private recently transferred from Fort Hood, said the smell triggered a kind of nausea he had never experienced, not in his stomach, but at the level of consciousness itself. as if his brain were rejecting something that didn't belong in this world. Cole grabbed his and slashed PVS-31 night vision goggles, checked the batteries and focus, then pulled an M4 carbine from the armory. According to rules of engagement, he should have initiated contact, recorded the encounter, and used non-lethal measures if necessary. But that night, he didn't follow protocol. Not because he forgot, but because the moment he stepped outside, he saw the sky. He said the night sky looked like something had licked it. The stars were all in the right places, but the darkness behind them had a texture, a faint, shifting gray-white quality. Not clouds, not fog, but something like a translucent veil stretched across the inside of the sky. He checked the weather report. No precipitation, 10 miles visibility, 63% humidity. Perfectly normal conditions. But his eyes told him the sky was not normal. He reached the eastern fence. The two patrol soldiers had retreated to their vehicle, all lights off except the faint glow of a thermal imaging screen. The private looked pale, lips drained of color, eyes unnaturally bright. Cole asked what they had seen. The private said, "Sergeant, just look up." Cole looked up. That was the moment, the shift from routine boredom to something profoundly wrong. About 300 feet above the eastern fence hovered a cluster of lights. Not drone lights as he knew them. No FAA standard blinking red and green. These lights had no fixed color, or rather, their color was constantly changing. Sometimes cold white, sometimes amber, sometimes something in a spectrum his night vision gear couldn't quite capture, somewhere between ultraviolet and visible light. Their sizes varied too, some like basketballs, some like sedans. But no matter how large they appeared, whenever you tried to focus on them with the naked eye, they blurred, like pebbles seen underwater. What unsettled Cole most wasn't their presence, it was how they moved. There was no rotor noise, no jet engine roar, not even the slightest disturbance of air. These lights didn't fly, they vanished from one position and appeared in another, with no continuous trajectory in between. This wasn't high-speed maneuvering. High speed still implies motion. What he was seeing felt like a redefinition of position itself. He counted them. 32. 32 unidentified aerial contacts, hovering above the eastern fence of Vandenberg, moving in a formation he couldn't comprehend. Not the geometric precision of human formations, not the fluid dynamics of a flock of birds, but something like the crystallization of a snowflake, fractaling and recombining in a constantly evolving structure. Every point was moving, yet the center of mass remained fixed. It reminded him of a term from a college physics class, self-organized criticality. A term he had never expected to use in a patrol report. He keyed his radio and called the Base Operations Center directly. The duty officer was a major. Cole couldn't remember his name, only that his voice sounded like he was chewing something. The major said thermal imaging had already picked it up and was being analyzed. Then he asked a question that sent a chill down Cole's spine. "Are you hearing anything?" Cole listened. Until that moment, he had been so focused on the visual that he hadn't noticed the soundscape had changed. Now he heard it, a low-frequency, continuous tone. Not an engine, not wind, not anything mechanical or natural he recognized. The wavelength was so long he couldn't locate its direction, so long he could feel it resonating in his chest, so long his teeth began to ache at the roots. He described it as a kind of auditory cold, not that the sound itself was frightening, but that its frequency triggered an instinctive certainty. This is not a sound that belongs in this world. He was about to report that detail when all 32 lights went out at once. They didn't fly away. They didn't crash. They went out, like someone flipped a switch. The sky snapped back to normal. The stars were where they should be. The darkness returned to ordinary darkness. Even that low-frequency hum vanished. Everything vanished. It was as if those few minutes had been cut cleanly out of the fabric of time, leaving no seam, no trace they had ever been there. Over the radio, Command asked. "Contact is gone. Can you confirm?" Cole replied. "Confirmed. All contacts gone," Command said. "Copy. Continue patrol. Do not file a written report. Await further instructions." "Do not file a written report. Await further instructions." Cole told me that when he heard that, something tightened in his chest. Not because it was surprising, but because it was familiar. Stay in the military long enough, and you learn there are things the chain of command doesn't want on paper. Not because of classification, but because once it's written down, it becomes something that has to be explained. And some things can't be explained. Back in the barracks, Cole didn't write anything. He just sat on his bunk with the night vision goggles resting on his knees, staring at them for a long time. His roommate, a staff sergeant from Michigan, asked what was wrong. Cole said nothing. There was too much he wanted to say, and almost nothing he could. He wanted to say, "I just saw something that couldn't be ours, couldn't belong to anyone I know, couldn't even belong to anything I understand." But he didn't say it, because he knew that the moment he did, he'd become that guy, the one who'd spent too long in the monitoring room, the one who'd watched too many possums on infrared. In the military, being labeled mentally unstable is harder to come back from than being called a coward. A coward can be understood. A soldier who claims to have seen something that shouldn't exist gets a different label, one that invalidates every report, erases every observation, turns him into an unreliable narrator. So Cole stayed silent. What he didn't know was that Vandenberg wasn't the only place visited that night. In Nevada, at Naval Air Station Fallon, ground personnel from the Navy's Fighter Weapons School reported a similar aerial formation at 3:20 a.m. Fallon's air defense radar picked up a cluster of returns, solid contacts. Not weather clutter, not birds, not any known electronic interference pattern. What baffled the radar operators was that the altitude and velocity parameters of these returns were changing in real time, by margins that should have been physically impossible. One return dropped from 8,000 feet to sea level in 0.3 seconds, then climbed back to 8,000 feet in half a second. The G-forces from such a maneuver would instantly black out any human pilot and tear apart any known airframe. But these returns didn't break apart. They didn't even slow down. They moved across the radar screen with an eerie grace, like a pianist playing a piece no one had ever heard. Fallon attempted electronic countermeasures. They activated full-spectrum jamming systems designed to suppress every known drone communication band. It had no effect. The lights showed no sign of interference, no deviation, no change in formation, no behavioral adjustment. It was as if they didn't rely on communication links at all, didn't use radio frequencies, didn't depend on any portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, known or unknown, to coordinate. They were simply there, connected, aware, synchronized in a way humans don't yet understand. Fallon's Operations Center issued an urgent request for air support from Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake. The response: their airspace was experiencing the same unidentified contacts at the exact same time. All available assets were already committed. No support could be provided. None of this was made public, at least not then. Cole only heard about Fallon months later, through someone he knew in the Navy. The guy tried to sound casual on the phone. "Man, you guys at Vandenberg saw them too? We thought our radar was broken." Cole didn't respond. He just wrote down the date in his notebook, March 11th, 2026. Then he stared at it and realized something. That same afternoon, U.S. Northern Command had held a press briefing at the Pentagon about the so-called drone swarm incursions. The spokesperson used a lot of technical language. Non-cooperative aerial contacts, unattributed systemic intrusions, ongoing technical assessment. But all those words meant one thing: we don't know what they are, we don't know where they come from, and we don't know how to deal with them. Now Cole understood what "do not file a written report" really meant. It wasn't about hiding information. It was about the absence of categories. What do you put under nationality? What do you write under platform? Under intent? You can't just write unknown, because unknown implies something that can be investigated. An investigation might open a door you don't want opened. So the simplest solution is to let the report disappear. Let the observation disappear. Let the soldier who saw something that shouldn't exist become an unreliable narrator. But that was only the first night. Cole told me that what happened on the second night was when he truly understood another dimension of fear. Not the fear of injury or death, but something more primitive, something that makes you question whether your senses can be trusted. A fear that doesn't come from an external threat, but from a voice deep inside asking, "Are you sure you're awake? Are you sure what you're seeing is real? Are you sure you're not losing your mind?" The second night came a week later. That week, Cole had been reassigned to an outer patrol, covering the western perimeter near the Pacific coastline. It was a more remote stretch. No fences, just low sand dunes and rows of abandoned World War II-era concrete bunkers. The nights were darker, the wind stronger, the only sound the ocean crashing against the cliffs. Cole liked it there. No 17 screens, no humming air conditioning, no duty officer chewing into the radio. Just him, his M4, his night vision, and the Pacific. That night, the sound of the ocean stopped. Not gradually. Not the calm of wind dying down. It was sudden, absolute, like a blade cutting through sound itself. One moment the waves were breaking in their steady rhythm. The next, all sound was gone. Not quieter, gone. Erased at a physical level. He could still see the waves rolling under the moonlight, white foam bursting against the rocks. But he couldn't hear a thing. It was a schizophrenic sensation, vision and hearing delivering completely contradictory inputs about the same reality. His brain raised an alarm. Something is wrong. The acoustic environment has been altered. He dropped to a crouch, killed his flashlight, and brought up his night vision goggles. In the green glow, he first saw the shoreline. Then he saw the sky. There were more lights this time. He later estimated over 100. No longer a cluster hovering over the eastern fence, but spread across the entire western sky, from the horizon to the upper limits of his night vision. Their glow was no longer the shifting, soft hues of before. Now it was a steady, harsh, almost hostile white light. Even through the goggles, it hurt his eyes. He adjusted the gain. No change. That meant their brightness exceeded the design limits of the N/PVS-31. Then he saw what was on the shoreline. Under the combined light of the moon and those objects above, Cole saw a dozen or more humanoid silhouettes standing where the surf met the sand. They weren't soldiers. Not beachgoers. Not any human form he could recognize. Their proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, torsos too short, heads placed and sized in ways that didn't match human anatomy. They moved slowly, not walking, but sliding. Their feet never lifted. Their bodies didn't shift weight. They simply vanished from one position and appeared in another, just like the lights above. Cole raised his M4 and looked through the optic. The magnification revealed more detail. Their surface wasn't skin, wasn't fabric. It was something he had never seen before, like metal and organic tissue fused together, reflecting an unnatural, oil-slick iridescence under the moonlight. Their heads had no facial features, just smooth, oval contours. Where eyes should have been, there were two thin, glowing slits. His breathing hitched, not out of fear, but because his brain refused to process what he was seeing. In that instant, his cognition overloaded like a crashing computer. The image was there, the data was there, but he couldn't assign meaning to it. This was something more primitive than fear. Not, I'm afraid of that thing, but, that thing does not exist in my model of the world, so my mind refuses to run. Then he heard something. Not the low-frequency hum from before, but a high-pitched, insect-like vibration, like cicadas. It didn't come from any direction. It resonated inside his skull. His teeth began to ache sharply. His temples throbbed. Colored distortions crept into the edges of his vision, artifacts that had nothing to do with his night vision settings. He felt control slipping. His fingers loosened on the trigger. His knees began to bend. His body leaned forward, as if to kneel. He didn't know why. There was no awe, no submission, no emotion at all. His body was executing a command, and that command wasn't coming from his conscious mind. It was coming from the sound itself. He dropped to his knees. The sand soaked into his uniform. Cold seawater flooded over his boots. He was kneeling in the Pacific surf, drenched from the knees down, but he couldn't feel the cold. He couldn't feel anything. His awareness was still there. He could see the humanoid shapes moving toward him, their gliding motion slow but steadily closing the distance. He wanted to run, to fire, to call for support, but his body refused every command his mind issued. His body no longer belonged to him. When the figures were less than 50 feet away, the lights in the sky changed all at once. The harsh white shifted into a deep red, a dark, ominous red, like the color of a total solar eclipse. The figures on the shoreline stopped. They turned toward the sky in unison, heads tilting back slightly. The glowing slits where their eyes should have been grew brighter. Then Cole heard something new. Not the low-frequency hum, not the high-pitched vibration, but fragments of something like language. Not English, not Spanish, not any human language on Earth. It had no vowels or consonants, no words, no sentence structure. It was more like structured noise, injected directly into his consciousness. For a few seconds, Cole received fragments of information, not full sentences, but impressions, like the fading residue of a dream. He felt, somehow, that the message was this: they were here to measure. Measure what? He didn't know if he had truly received anything, or if his mind, pushed to its limits, had fabricated something it could barely understand. Then it all ended. The lights vanished. The sound stopped. The figures on the shoreline were gone. The Pacific roared back to life, as if it had never gone silent. Cole was still on his knees in the freezing surf, soaked through, teeth chattering, his M4 lying in the sand beside him, the barrel packed with salt water and grit. It took him nearly 2 minutes to regain control of his body. He stood up, picked up his weapon, checked the magazine. Ammunition intact. Safety still on. He had never fired a single shot. He keyed his radio. Patrol 3 to command, west shoreline. Requesting instructions. Static. Command, this is Patrol 3, west shoreline. Requesting instructions. More static. He checked the frequency. Correct. Switched to backup channels, same result. He cycled through all 7 presets. Nothing. This wasn't a coverage issue. Vandenberg's radio network blanketed the entire peninsula. No dead zones. What he was facing wasn't signal loss. It was total system absence. The radio wasn't broken. The frequencies weren't jammed. There was simply no one on the other end. As if the entire base had gone dark at the same moment the lights did. Cole started running back toward the western perimeter. 15 minutes. 3 sand dunes. A dry riverbed. Then, finally, lights from the barracks in the distance. The lights were still on. And just like that, the static vanished. Patrol 3, your signal was lost for 18 minutes. Report your position and status. 18 minutes. Cole checked his watch. From the moment his radio first dissolved into static until now, 18 minutes had passed. But in his own perception, from kneeling in the surf to standing again, it had been no more than 1 or 2. Time had stretched, or compressed, or folded. He couldn't tell. He only knew that 18 minutes of his life had been cleanly cut out of his awareness, just like those lights had erased their own trajectories from the sky. He didn't mention the missing time in his report. He said only that he had experienced a temporary radio malfunction during patrol, now resolved. Any anomalies observed? Command asked. No. All normal. It was the first time he had ever lied in uniform. Not out of fear, not under orders, but out of instinct. Because he knew what would happen if he told the truth, if he described the figures, the language, the loss of control. He would be pulled from duty, sent to a military psychological evaluation center, asked if he had thoughts of harming himself or others, if he heard voices, if he believed he was being watched. He would lose his role, his identity, his place. Everything he said would be reinterpreted as symptoms, not observations. So he stayed silent. But silence has a cost. After the second night, Cole told me, he could no longer see darkness the same way. It used to be just the absence of light, something you could penetrate with night vision, flashlights, infrared. Now it felt like something with weight, something alive, something that breathed. On patrol, he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder. On the monitor screens, he searched unconsciously for those impossible, shifting lights. When he heard the ocean, he listened for that sudden, surgical silence. His body remembered what it felt like to lose control. On sleepless nights, he could feel that tremor rising from the base of his spine, spreading through his nerves, like a cold hand moving beneath his skin. He started keeping a notebook. Not reports, notes for himself. He recorded everything. The number of lights on the first night, their color changes, their formation patterns, the missing time on the second night, the silence, the fragments of language. He sketched the figures, the proportions of their limbs, the placement of their heads, the iridescent sheen of their surface. He wrote down the fragments he couldn't explain: measurement, calibration, boundary, threshold. The words came out of him, but he didn't know what they meant, only that they had to be written down, because forgetting to him was worse than death. Death is the end of existence. Forgetting means letting something real, something that should never be ignored, sink back into the fog. He searched for similar records. In internal military databases, he looked up keywords: unidentified aerial contact, drone intrusion, radar anomaly. He found reports. Most were marked unresolved, or pending further investigation. But the bodies of the reports were strangely brief, full of phrases like operator misidentification, meteorological phenomenon, system malfunction. Cole knew what that meant. It meant the people who filed those reports had made the same choice he had. They saw something they shouldn't have, and described it in the safest possible language, wrapping the unexplainable core in terms that could be explained. The reports remained in the system. The truth was buried underneath them. He found one from Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, dated November 2025. It described a formation of unidentified aerial phenomena over White Sands Missile Range, exhibiting maneuvers beyond known aerodynamic limits. The final line read, "Recommend classification as meteorological clutter." Cole stared at that sentence for a long time. Meteorological clutter. To take something beyond human understanding and file it as weather interference. That was the most rational choice a soldier could make. Because if you don't call it weather, you have to call it something else. And that something else forces you to question everything. The meaning of your service, the solidity of the world you swore to defend. He kept digging. Dyess Air Force Base, Texas. September 2025. Yuma Proving Ground, Arizona. July 2025. Joint Base Langley, Eustis, Virginia. April 2025. One base after another. One drone intrusion after another. One meteorological clutter after another. Together, they formed a pattern. Increasing frequency, expanding range, converging characteristics. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic, coordinated, purposeful. Cole began to believe that the fragments he had received might be real. They were measuring. Measuring what? Our defensive depth, our response time, our threshold for fear, our capacity, as a civilization, to remain rational, or to fracture, when confronted with something beyond comprehension. But he had no proof, only his notebook, his memory, and that tremor at the base of his spine that never went away. In March 2026, U.S. Northern Command made its public announcement about drone swarm incursions. Cole's superiors held a full briefing. The speaker was a civilian official Cole didn't recognize, dark suit, tie, out of place in a room full of uniforms. He explained that the incursions were systematic reconnaissance activities conducted by unknown actors using commercial drone technology, and that the military was upgrading counter-drone systems and enhancing intelligence sharing. He spoke calmly, evenly, like a weather anchor reading a forecast. But Cole noticed something else. The man's left hand kept unconsciously rubbing the wedding ring on his right. A friend of Cole's, who studied psychology, once told him that's a self-soothing behavior. It shows up when someone is saying something they don't fully believe. After the briefing, Cole approached him. "Sir?" he asked. "What if these aren't commercial drones? What if we're dealing with a technology we don't understand at all?" The official looked at him. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not surprise, not anger, not avoidance. Something tired. Something almost sad. In that instant, Cole knew. This man knew more than he was saying. Then the moment passed. The official patted him on the shoulder. "Sergeant, do your job. Don't let your imagination interfere with your judgment. Don't let your imagination interfere with your judgment." Cole went back to the barracks, sat on his bunk, and took out his notebook. He looked at the sketches, the timelines, the fragments of information, and suddenly laughed. Not a happy laugh, but a bitter one. The kind that comes when you finally understand the position you're in. He was being told not to let imagination interfere with judgment. But what he had faced was something imagination itself could never reach. His imagination had never prepared him for kneeling in the Pacific surf, staring at things that shouldn't exist, hearing a language injected directly into his mind. That wasn't imagination. That was what happens when imagination collapses, and reality crashes in, raw and unfiltered. What he didn't know was that night wasn't the end. The third night was the worst of all. Cole didn't like talking about it. Every time I tried to steer the conversation there, he would go quiet, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he'd say, "Let's talk about something else." But one time, at 2 a.m., he called me. His voice was low, fast, like he was trying to empty something out before it built up again. "You know," he said, "sometimes I think they're not measuring us. I think they're teaching us how to see, how to hear, how to realize that everything we think we know exists inside this tiny bubble. And outside that bubble, there's a darkness we don't even have the language to describe. We think night vision lets us see in the dark, but all it does is translate darkness into green. Real darkness doesn't need translation. Real darkness is realizing you're nothing." On the third night, Cole said, the sky split open. Not metaphorically, not a hallucination, physically, visibly, in a way that broke his visual system completely. Above the northern training grounds, the lights gathered into a massive, rotating spiral. At its center wasn't light, but a perfectly black disk. Not darkness from absence, but something that swallowed light itself, like a hole burned into the sky, even through night vision. Then it expanded. It consumed the spiral, the stars, the moon, everything in his field of view. Cole felt his consciousness being pulled toward it, not physically, but existentially. His memory, his identity, his sense of self, stripped away layer by layer, like peeling an onion. He forgot who he was, forgot where he was, forgot what fear even meant. All that remained was awareness. Bare, disembodied awareness, suspended in a void with no time, no space, no causality. Then he heard a voice. Not noise, not fragments. A clear, complete sentence, in English. The voice had no direction, no tone, no emotion. It said, "We have always been here." Cole told me that in that moment, he cried. Not from fear, not from sadness. Something else, something he couldn't name. Like a child who's been blindfolded for a long time, finally allowed to see sunlight again. Not relief, not joy, just confirmation. Oh, so you've always been there. So I've always been watched. So I've never been alone. Then he woke up. He was lying on the training field grass. Night vision goggles around his neck. M4 beside his hand. Battery dead. Watch stopped. Phone blacked out. Every powered device was dead. The sky was normal. Stars steady overhead. The Pacific rumbling faintly in the distance. He sat up. Checked himself. No injuries. No pain. Just a strange, hungover exhaustion. He tried to remember what had just happened, but the memory slipped through his mind like water. He remembered the sky splitting, the black disk, the voice, but not the words. Only that the words mattered. More than his life, more than his country, more than anything he understood, and he couldn't remember them. He grabbed his notebook and started writing frantically, anything he could salvage. Words. Split, void, voice, always there. He knew it wasn't enough. The important part was gone. Lost in those missing minutes, lost in whatever folds time had taken, lost behind whatever barrier his mind had built to protect itself. He closed the notebook, shoved it into his uniform, and walked back to the barracks. The next day, he filed for reassignment. Reason: personal. No one asked questions. A week later, he was transferred to a logistics unit in Nevada, managing night vision inventory in a warehouse. He spent the rest of his service counting and /PVS 31 units, checking battery expiration dates, filling out routine reports. He never saw the lights again, never heard the sound, never smelled that wrong, impossible scent. But he never forgot, because he chose not to. When U.S. Northern Command released its March 2026 statement saying the origins and operators of the drone swarms were difficult to determine, Cole read it sitting in the Nevada desert, notebook in hand, rows of unused night vision goggles stacked neatly in front of him. He knew the statement was true, and incomplete. True, because they really didn't know what those things were. Incomplete, because it wasn't a lack of data. It was too much data, more than any existing framework could contain. Every radar return, every sitrep, every infrared clip pointed to the same conclusion: they weren't ours. Not China's, not Russia's, not anyone's. They might not even be aircraft. If flight means overcoming gravity, they might not care about gravity. They might not care about our physics. They might not care about us at all. That's Sergeant Cole's story. A story about a soldier lost in the fog of war, struggling, enduring, and ultimately choosing silence. But his silence wasn't surrender. It was resistance. Resistance against forgetting. Against simplification. Against the instinct to label the unexplainable as meteorological clutter and move on. His notebook still exists. His memory still exists. That tremor at the base of his spine still exists. And as long as they do, that night remains real. No matter what the Pentagon says, no matter what the officials say, no matter how many reports are filed under weather interference. The last time Cole called me was on a Saturday afternoon. His voice was calmer than I'd ever heard it. I figured something out, he said. They're not just measuring, they're reminding us. Reminding us that we think we own this planet, but we're just tenants. And the lease can end any time. And the landlord? We've never even seen them. I asked him if he was afraid. A long pause. No, he said. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm just curious. Curious when they'll show up again. Curious whether I'll kneel next time. Curious whether I'll be able to stand back up. Then the line went dead. I sat in a dark room, listening to the silence, thinking about what he'd said. Then I looked out the window. The sky was clear. The stars were bright. Everything was normal, unsettlingly normal. I'm your narrator, someone who tells stories about the supernatural hidden in the fog of war. If you ask me what these swarms really are, I won't give you an answer. Because some answers exist beyond the boundaries we can reach. They're deeper in the fog, in that gray space between reality and the unreal. In the notebooks of soldiers who chose silence. All we can do is remember. Remember that they came. Remember that they watched us. Remember what they said. We have always been here. And always means before now. Before the first airplane. Before the first electric light. Before humanity ever looked up at the stars and started telling stories about them. They were already there. Older tenants than we are. Or maybe, they were never tenants at all. This is the story from the night vision room at Vandenberg Space Force Base. The truth Sergeant Cole bought with his silence. Now it's yours. You can file it away as meteorological clutter. Or you can write it into your own notebook and let it become part of that tremor at the base of your spine that never quite goes away. The choice is yours. But before you make that choice, I want to ask you a question. The same question Sergeant Cole asked himself in the early hours of that third night, lying on the training field, staring at a sky that had split open, and then sealed itself again. If they really are just drones, why can't our air defense systems stop them? If they're truly weapons from a foreign adversary, why can't the Pentagon even identify their origin? If they're only hallucinations, why did so many trained soldiers, at the same time, see the same lights, hear the same sounds, smell the same scent, feel the same tremor? And if they are none of those things, if they are something beyond our understanding, beyond classification, beyond response, then how much of the world we train for, fight for, and sacrifice for, is actually real? Think about that. Because in this story, the most terrifying part isn't the lights, or the figures, or the language injected into the mind. The most terrifying part is that when it's all over, we don't even have a report we can fill out truthfully. And that means something deeper. Within the cognitive framework our civilization has built for itself, there is no place reserved for phenomena like this. They're not on our maps. Not in our history. Not in our myths. They are entirely, absolutely, other. And when humans face something truly other, we only have two options. Either we make it part of ourselves, or we pretend it doesn't exist. We didn't make it part of ourselves, so we pretend. But how long can that last? On the last page of his notebook, Sergeant Cole wrote a single line in pencil. The handwriting was faint, like he already knew time would erase it. They are not ours. But maybe we once were theirs. I don't know what that means. Maybe Cole didn't either. Maybe all he could do, after those 18 missing minutes, was carve a small marker for something that couldn't be put into words. Now I'm placing a copy of that marker in front of you. May you never have to kneel in the Pacific surf at 2 a.m. But if you do, may you still be able to stand back up. May you still remember. May your notebook never stay blank. This is a voice from the fog of war. I'll see you next time, deeper in the fog.